In this video, I'll be sharing my experience with the Fujifilm X-T50. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be offering you my experiences with the Fujifilm X-T50. Now, this is Fujifilm's new mid-range SLR-styled body that sits just like the other iterations in this series, right below the flagship X-T5. It has the same sensor as the X-T5, the same autofocus technology as the X-T5, potentially the same in-body image stabilization performance as the X-T5, the same rear LCD, and they've just sort of tightly packed all of this into a much smaller and lighter camera. And there's absolutely a lot to love about this camera, but as we'll see, my experience hasn't been all positive. Now, this won't be a typical review that you see from me. I'll still try to give the same insights as I always do, but if you want to hear about all the new features and specs and things like that, you might want to look to another review. Now, typically, I do always like to try to find a potential use case, even for gear that I wouldn't use myself, and I'll certainly be doing that here, but I will be sharing some extremely negative experiences that I've had with the X-T50. Now, this is not the video that I wanted to make about this camera. I really did want to love it, and as we'll see, I tried to make it work, but in the end, it just didn't work out for me. But before we get into that story, though, let's talk a little bit about the camera and sort of where it fits into Fujifilm's lineup. As with all my camera reviews, I want to start with the why I decided to invest in this camera. And when I first saw that Fujifilm was going to be releasing this camera, I could barely believe the amount of technology they'd actually managed to pack into such a tiny little body. And in the never-ending quest to find a camera that sort of fulfills all my uses, something that I enjoy using and makes me want to take it everywhere, I decided that it was finally time for me to part ways with my X100V and move to an interchangeable lens camera for my everyday uses. And the basic uses that I have for a camera like this are for my personal work and for scouting for clients. Now, did I need something new for that? Absolutely not. But what I was hoping to gain was a versatile camera that could basically be paired with tiny little lenses like the XF16mm f2.8 or the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 to make a very, very small package, but then could also be scaled up if I wanted to use some of the larger, higher quality prime lenses that I have. So I just basically wanted that flexibility which the X100V didn't give to me, and we'll see how all that went in the field section of this review. Let's start this section of the review with the price of the X-T50. Now, it has a recommended retail price of $1,399 US for the body only. Now, keep that in mind for the rest of the review. That's $500 more than its predecessor. Sure, it's a more capable camera, has a higher resolution sensor, has IBIS, has a faster processor, but to put that into perspective, the X-T5 has all of that, and it's only $300 more than this camera. And on the surface, the X-T50 looks like a good budget way to get into the same functionality of the X-T5, but when you actually get it into your hands, there are some significant differences that are definitely worth considering. So let's start with the good. This is a tiny body suited to very small lenses and small hands. It's a great partner for lenses like the XF16mm f2.8 or the XF35mm f1.4. But even the XF33mm f1.4 looks like an absolute monster on this body. Thankfully, Fujifilm opted for the tilting screen design rather than the fully articulating one that we saw come to the XS series of cameras. And unfortunately, it doesn't flip out vertically like the one on the X-T5, which is a bit of a shame, but not a deal breaker. Still, I would rate this one above the XS screen for photography uses. Now, next, Fujifilm has kept the X-T style of focus lever on this camera, which is just so much more accurate when it comes to, moving focus points around or selecting things in the menu. And since this camera doesn't have a D-pad, you will be using that joystick a lot. So it's really great to see that they didn't switch it for the abomination that's on the XH2S. Battery life. Now, in the couple of reviews that I have read, I've seen that people complain about this quite a bit, but in my experience, it's been fairly good for the most part, and I will get into an issue I've had with that shortly. But for now, let's just say I've been getting between 500 and 800 images per charge when shooting RAW and JPEG, which is plenty for a tiny little camera like this that's been designed for consumer use through and through. It's not a professional tool. Now, it's nothing like you'll get from the X-T5, but that's to be expected with the smaller battery powering what is essentially the same technology. The overall quality of the materials used in the body and the pressable buttons on it feel solid and much more refined than in previous iterations in this series. Now, Fujifilm has really come a long way in this regard with all of their different camera series, and the X-T50 is no exception there. But unfortunately, that is about all the positives that I have in terms of the build quality for this camera. To kick the negatives off, and there are quite a few of them, let's start with simple day-to-day use. Firstly, there's the memory card. Now, the simple act of getting it out to copy images isn't as simple as a press and pull like every other camera that I've ever used. Fujifilm has made the camera so tiny that it's almost impossible with average-sized fingers to be able to pull the memory card out of the slot. It requires me to push the memory card against the spring and basically launch it out of the slot. Now, sometimes there's enough friction that the slot will actually hold on to the memory card, and sometimes it just goes flying across the room, and an extra millimeter there would be enough to get your fingers around it and allow you to pull it out rather than having to play this game every single time. And the next thing also relates to size. The camera gets hot, and I mean uncomfortably hot when using it in warm weather. I've found myself having to actually switch it off and put it down. Now, it's not going to burn you by any stretch of the imagination, but it runs the hottest of any camera that I have ever used, and it's really not great if you live somewhere that actually has a summer. Summer weather is another point that we will get back to later in this review. Now, the film simulation dial. Now, it's a quaint idea, and I get that Fujifilm really wants people to focus on the colors that their cameras produce out of the box, which is actually one of the only reasons I still use Fujifilm cameras, so I completely understand that. Now, when you first get the X-T50 out of the box, it has 3 methods to change the film simulation pre-mapped onto the camera. Fujifilm, we get the point. The dial would have been enough. But back to that dial though. It's too easy to knock, and I found myself just changing film simulations that I didn't want to do by pulling it out of my bag or knocking it against my leg while I've been walking around. The dial really should have a lock on top of it or be a little bit stiffer to turn, and if I'm honest, I'd really rather it just be customizable to something that I'm actually going to use, like ISO for example. Understandably, this would completely break the concept of the camera, and Fujifilm will likely never allow that, but here's to hoping. While we're talking about controls, let's get onto the front and rear dials. They're really not up to scratch for a body that costs this much. Fujifilm seems to have reused what feel like the same old dials from the X-T10 that I owned all those years ago. They feel really mushy to push in, and they don't always register the correct direction of turning when you move them quickly, in my experience. This is really disappointing when the price has jumped so much from the previous model to this one. The image quality of this sensor is a known quantity now. It's been in several of Fujifilm's cameras and produces excellent images, as we've seen. What is a little different, and perhaps bears considering, is how effective the tiny IBIS unit is in a really small body that isn't as stable to grip as some of Fujifilm's larger cameras. Now, I have no way to scientifically test the IBIS on this camera and verify that Fujifilm's claims of 7 stops of stabilization are true, but I will say that it's been absolutely great. On the few occasions that I've stress tested it, I've been able to get sharp images where it simply wouldn't have been possible without stabilization. For example, on this morning when I was out cycling in the countryside here in Korea, I wanted to get a quick shot of this gorgeous mountain stream with a longer shutter speed to capture the movement in the water. For this sort of use, not having to carry a tripod around and still being able to slow the shutter speed down this much has made this camera an absolute joy to use for me. But that's not my main use for IBIS though. For me, it's just that ability to go down to, a 60th or a 30th of a second reliably in any situation. And even though Fujifilm's APS-C cameras have good ISO performance, I still like to keep my ISO value as low as possible whenever I can for clean files with the most dynamic range possible, and the IBIS in the X-T50 does a great job of that. Next, I'm going to share my personal experience with the build quality of this camera. I'm not suggesting that this will be your experience, but I can't post this review in good faith without telling you this story. Now, in my experience, and again, it is my experience and it may not mirror yours, this is the least reliable body that Fujifilm has ever produced. So far, from my sample size of 2, I've had to return one the day after purchasing it and take the other one in 3 times for service since having it. Now, I've requested a full refund from Fujifilm at this stage, and I will keep you updated in a pinned comment below to let you know how that goes. So, the first body. When I got the box home, I quickly charged up the battery and set about trolling through the menus to set up the camera the way I would like to use it. And after about 5 minutes or so of assigning buttons and switching settings on and off to match my style of working, I took my first image. And great. everything is working, I thought. So I picked up the camera, a couple of lenses, and I went outside to do a bit of a walk around like I always do when I get a new piece of equipment and I'm trying to learn how it works and how it's going to work for me. On my second image, however, the shutter moved up, down, about 5 times before locking itself over the top of the sensor and not allowing any of the camera's functions to work. I switched the camera off and back on again, and when it fired up, the shutter did exactly the same thing again, going up and down, and then the dreaded turn the camera off and back on again message popped up on the LCD. So I took the battery out, put the battery back in, turned the camera on again, same problem. Okay, brand new X-T50, just put a lens on it for the first time, upgraded to firmware version 1.02. Let's turn the camera on. Randomly shoots pictures, turn off the camera and turn the camera on again. Thinking that it might be a lens issue, I took the lens off, tried another lens, had the same issue again. So I took a trip to the Fujifilm service center, and 5 minutes later, I had a dead on arrival notice in my hands and the receipt for delivery of a new camera. Now, 3 days later, I took delivery of my new X-T50 and went through the same process of setting it up. So far, so good. So I decided to take it on a personal trip down to Jeju Island and just shoot some street photography in between the jobs I had while I was down there. The first day went off without a hitch, and I was enjoying getting used to this tiny new body. At the end of the second day, we had some beautiful storm clouds brewing on the horizon and some moments of sunlight peeking through them, so I decided to take another walk around the alleys nearby my hotel and try to catch some moments of that light. And all was going really well until this frame here. I shot the image, heard the camera start to make a clicking noise as though magnets were engaging and disengaging, and again it just stopped responding, but this time there was nothing on the LCD or EVF at all. It was just a dead black screen. I repeated all the steps I had done the previous time when the camera failed to absolutely no avail. It had completely stopped functioning again. So after taking off the lens, I noticed that the IBIS unit was actually trying to go through its power on self-test and failing. So as the camera was switched on, the IBIS unit would just click back and forth, but never find what it was looking for, and so could never get through that test. On the way to the service center for the second time, I decided I'd try to fix it like an old-fashioned television and just give it a tap a couple of times on the top, and like magic, this seemed to reseat the IBIS unit and the camera started functioning again. Still, I took it into the service center, explained what had happened, and showed them the video of the issue. Now, they disassembled the camera, detached and reattached the IBIS unit to make sure that it was secure, and then returned the camera to me in the hopes that this would basically, be the solution. Now, one other thing that was mentioned to me at that time was that there was water inside the camera, and they'd cleaned it out for me. Now, given that I hadn't been near any water or out in any rain, the only thing that I could think of was that this would be sweat drops or humidity from the ridiculously hot summer that we've been having this year. About 2 months of weather above 30 degrees Celsius and 90% humidity or higher every single day. There's just really no avoiding moisture or sweat at this time of year. So if this was the case and Fujifilm has produced a camera that can't be used in summer, that would be a real disappointment, especially given that a second-hand X-T5 could be had for around the price of this camera and is absolutely bomb-proof by comparison. But on to my third service center visit. This time around, I'd noticed that the camera was just discharging overnight. Now, I don't mean it was losing 1% battery to keep the camera functions working or maybe save things into memory. I'd charged it to 100% before going to bed, and it was dead when I woke up. And at first, I thought I'd left it in my bag and maybe left the switch on and it was running the LCD all night or something like that. But after several tests, I found that it was losing about 10% battery per hour while the camera was just turned off and sitting on my desk. The verdict this time was that the camera's mainboard had an issue with power management and was replaced under warranty. Now, as nice as it is to have a functioning warranty system and a nearby service center, at this stage I've completely lost faith in the X-T50 from a durability standpoint. Over 2 months of owning it, I've had a new body given to me, the mainboard replaced, and been in the service center more times than I would like to have been. That's really not great for any camera, let alone one at this price point. Now, I've now requested a full return and refund on this camera from Fujifilm, and I will let you guys know how that goes. So, with my limited experience, I'm not going to get out there and claim that the X-T50 has production issues, but I'm also not willing to chalk this many issues up to simple chance. Now, if you're planning to invest in an X-T50, I'd be sure that you have an accessible service center nearby just in case. Okay, Editing Dylan here with a quick update on the refund situation. So Fujifilm Korea have refused my request for a refund on the basis that when they opened this camera up the first time to do repairs on it, they allegedly found water inside. Now, I can't disprove that fact, and they can't disprove the fact of what I'm claiming, that I never took it out in inclement weather or down near any water or anything like that. If they have a functioning quality control system, then the only way water could have got into this camera is through some fault of mine, and of course that voids the warranty. So I completely understand that, but I have asked for a contact for Fujifilm International to see if I can have my case heard with them as well, and hopefully get a refund on this, because I just can't trust this camera anymore. In the meantime though, I will be making some more content with this camera. I'll be heading out, taking some pictures with it, just putting it through its paces, and continue to use it, because that's better than using it as a paperweight. Now, I've also just recently taken it down to the beach, since I really have no fear anymore, and I have started taking a few photos of the ocean as well, so you'll see those in this video. But I will update you if anything else changes, but for now, let's get back to the video. Aside from all the issues that I've had with this camera, how's it been when I've actually been able to take it out and make use of it? Well, it performs quite well, as we'd expect from the 5th generation of Fujifilm's cameras. Now, once you've got all of your settings in place, it really doesn't miss a beat. And having said that though, getting to all those settings can be a little slower to access than something like the X-T5, as the body really is set up to be used by an absolute beginner. Now, if you like working in full manual mode to quickly switch between a lot of different settings at once, such as aperture, shutter speed, ISO, maybe some autofocus settings, you quickly run into the limitations of usability of this camera. The front and rear dials can't really keep up with quick changes in my experience, and there aren't enough custom buttons on the body to be able to put all the settings that you might want to have assigned to them. So it's definitely designed for more casual, slow-paced work, but we expect that from this series of cameras. Now, when it comes to location scouting for me, the tiny package of the X-T50 and the Sigma 18 to 50mm seem to make a lot of sense to me, and it's been a really great tool. I've been able to quickly check a location with a variety of focal lengths using this tiny little package, and then switch to one of my fast primes if I want to shoot something for myself after I finish scouting, or maybe check a particular scene at an extremely fast aperture. As for my personal work, it typically falls into 2 categories, and this is where the X100V has been such a great tool over the past few years. I mostly get chances to make images for myself when I'm out cycling or before and after a client shoot, and that means that I'm usually wanting to carry as little as possible in the case of cycling, or wanting to take a body in addition to my XH2S bodies that can help me to separate my client work from my personal work in terms of the way it feels to actually do it. And again, the X-T50 has been a really, really good body in a lot of ways for this. And actually, in a lot of ways, it's been better than the X100V at this because of all the different focal lengths that I get access to still in a small package, because this is an interchangeable lens body. My struggles with getting a reliable copy aside, the X-T50 is actually a really interesting offering from Fujifilm. It's an absolutely tiny package considering all the technology that's packed inside it, and if you're able to get a copy without any issues, it'll produce the same beautiful images that the XH2 and the X-T5 do. Now, what I will say is that, in my experience, it's not a camera that's going to stand up to rigorous use. The lack of weather sealing at this price point is a little bit disappointing, as is how hot the camera gets during normal use. I would have also liked to see a slightly higher magnification EVF at this price point as well, and in the end, at that price point, my recommendation is that unless you really love the film simulation dial or the tiny footprint of the camera, a second-hand X-T5 would actually be a better buy for most people. It has the larger battery, dual card slots, full weather sealing, and much higher quality buttons and dials. If the X-T50 were just a couple of $100 cheaper, I'd recommend it, but as it stands, it's a bit of a hard sell for me. So I hope this review has been helpful for you. If you've got any questions about this camera, please do let me know in the comments below, and I will try to get back to you. But for now, enjoy the slideshow, and I'll see you guys in the next video.